Hopi girl tied to a tree for wild beasts until Cowboy spotted her and refused to leave her behind. Nayeli sat alone under the wide Arizona sky, tied to the rough bark of an old tree. The sun beat down relentlessly, its heat seeming to burn everything around her.
She had been left here by her father, the man who was supposed to protect her. The land around her was harsh and empty, with only the sounds of the desert wind whispering through the sparse bushes and distant hills. It was as if the world had forgotten her. She had always been strong, like the other women of her tribe, the Hopi. They were known for their resilience, their connection to the land, and their ability to endure even the toughest challenges. But none of those qualities seemed to matter now. Round, he had been left to face the wild creatures of the desert, bound to the tree with no hope of escape. Her heart beat fast in her chest as fear crept in. The night would come soon, and with it the predators that prowled the land searching for their next meal. Nayeli had been given to raiders, her father's decision. The people who had threatened her village demanding payment were ruthless. In the end, her father had chosen to give her up, believing it would protect the rest of their family. But in doing so, he had betrayed everything she had known, everything she had been taught. She could barely understand how her father, the man she had always looked up to, could make such a decision. The thought of it made her stomach turn with shame and anger. She remembered the day it had all happened. Her father had stood tall, a proud leader in the village, when the raiders arrived. They had demanded something, and her father had agreed to their terms, unwilling to put his own life or the lives of the others in danger. As the raiders left with her, she had felt his eyes on her, cold and distant. He had done nothing to stop them. No words of comfort, no explanation, just silence as he watched her disappear into the desert. Now here she was, waiting for something to end it all. She had been tied to this tree for hours, her arms aching and her legs numb from sitting too long. The ropes bit into her skin, leaving marks, but she barely noticed. Her only thoughts were of the wild beasts that were sure to find her as darkness fell. She had heard stories of such creatures from the elders, beasts that roamed the desert, preying on the weak. She had heard the tales of people who had been lost, never to be seen again. Nayeli tried to fight the tears that threatened to fall. She was strong. She had always been strong. Desperate, but this was different. She had been left behind, abandoned by the very person who was supposed to protect her. Breath. She didn't know how much longer she could stay awake, her mind drifting between thoughts of her family, her village, and the fear of the unknown. She was alone, in the middle of a vast desert, with no one to save her. She tried to tell herself that she would survive, that she would find a way out of this, but the truth was, she didn't know how much longer she could hold on. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the shadows began to stretch across the desert floor. The temperature dropped quickly, and the air became colder. Day. Nayeli shivered, her body stiff from the long hours of being tied to the tree. She heard a noise, faint at first, like the sound of hooves on the hard earth. She strained her ears, wondering if it was just the wind or if something else was out there. The sound grew louder, and her heart began to race. Round in despair. She wasn't sure if she could believe her ears, but she hoped, prayed, that it was someone coming to help her. Maybe a search party from the village, maybe even her father. She tried to focus, trying to see through the growing darkness, but her eyes were blurry, her vision fading as the exhaustion took its toll. And then, through the shadows, she saw him. A man, a figure riding a horse, coming toward her. Fast, his silhouette was outlined against the fading light, a lone rider in the vast desert. For a moment, she couldn't believe her eyes. Was he real? Or was she imagining this, a product of her delirium? The man rode closer, and she could see him more clearly now. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a weathered face. His clothes were dusty, as if he had been riding for a long time. His eyes, though distant, held a sense of calm determination. He was a cowboy, the kind of man who lived alone on the edge of the world, a man who was no stranger to the harsh realities of life. His horse slowed as he drew near, and he looked down at Nayeli, who was still tied to the tree. At first, he didn't speak. He simply stared at her, as if trying to understand what had happened. Nayeli didn't have the strength to say anything, her voice too weak. She wanted to scream, to beg him for help, but she could barely move, barely think. All she could do was stare back at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The cowboy dismounted from his horse and walked toward her, his boots making soft thuds against the dry earth. He knelt beside her, his eyes scanning her face. He didn't ask any questions, didn't demand explanations. Instead, he reached for the ropes that held her to the tree, and with swift, practiced movements, he began to untie them. His hands were gentle but firm as he worked, his focus unwavering. Once she was free, he helped her sit up, supporting her with his strong arms. She felt weak, her body trembling from the strain of being bound for so long. Her mind was foggy, and her vision blurred, but she could feel the warmth of his presence. It was strange, but for the first time since the betrayal, she felt like someone cared. She wasn't alone anymore. The cowboy didn't say anything as he helped her onto his horse, guiding her gently. His actions spoke louder than any words could. He was not leaving her behind, not abandoning her like everyone else had. He had found her, and he wasn't going to let her suffer alone in the desert. As they rode away, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the desert was swallowed by the darkness of the night. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Nayeli felt a glimmer of hope. Jacob rode through the desert, his horse's hooves crunching against the dry ground. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the dust of the barren land. His mind raced, thoughts moving faster than the steady rhythm of the horse beneath him. Rasp. He wasn't sure why he had come this way, but something about the scene he had stumbled upon, the girl tied to the tree, had drawn him in like a magnet. There was a heaviness in his chest, a feeling that this moment, this chance meeting wasn't just a coincidence. As he guided the horse carefully across the rough terrain, he kept a watchful eye on Nayeli, who sat unsteadily behind him. She was silent, too weak to speak, but her body trembled from both exhaustion and the emotional weight of what she had endured. He could feel the tension in her, as if she were afraid to trust even the kindness of a stranger. Her breath was shallow, and her eyes remained closed for most of the ride, as though she was trying to escape the harsh reality of what had just happened. Jacob didn't push her to talk. He knew better than to rush someone who had been through so much. Instead, he focused on getting them both to safety. The desert could be unforgiving, and while the sun had set, the temperature was still dropping quickly, making the air crisp and cold. He pulled his coat tighter around him, wishing he had something to offer her. But he had only the horse and his determination to get them out of danger. He had seen a lot in his life, more than most people ever did, the lonely life of a cowboy. Wandering the open land had its moments of quiet, but there was also hardship. He had learned how to survive by relying on his instincts and his ability to endure. But even with all that experience, nothing had prepared him for the helplessness he felt when he had seen that girl tied to that tree with no one to protect her. She had been left there to face whatever fate awaited her. And he couldn't understand why. The desert could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful, and predators roamed the land, waiting for the weak and the vulnerable. Who could leave someone to die like that? What kind of person did that? But those questions were for later. Right now his focus was on Nayeli. She needed to rest, to regain some strength, and to know that she wasn't alone anymore. The thought of leaving her behind never crossed his mind. As they rode through the night, Jacob kept his movements slow and steady, trying to make the journey as smooth as possible. He knew that every bump in the road would be felt by her. Every jolt would make her body protest, so he did his best to shield her from the roughness, keeping his pace slow but deliberate. After what seemed like hours, they came to an old abandoned cabin tucked in the side of a small hill. The place looked weathered, as though it had been abandoned for years, but it would do. Jacob dismounted and helped Naeli down from the horse, lifting her carefully. "Hey!" She barely had the strength to stand, but her hands gripped his coat as he supported her. She was light in his arms, fragile, but he could feel her determination in the way she clung to him. Despite everything, she wasn't giving up.
Inside the cabin, the floor was covered in dust, the remnants of old wooden furniture scattered around.
The air smelled stale, but it was shelter from the night. Jacob helped Naeli over to the far corner of the room where a small fireplace sat, its ashes cold and dark. He set her down gently on the floor, grabbing a few old blankets from a nearby shelf and wrapping her up in them. He didn't have much, but he could give her warmth, at least for the night. Naeli's eyes fluttered open as she settled against the wall. Break. She didn't look at him, but she could feel his presence, steady and reassuring. The cowboy hadn't said much since they'd left the desert. He hadn't asked her about what had happened or why she had been left there, and that made her feel both grateful and guilty. She had never been a burden before. She had always been the strong one, the one who helped others, the one who took care of her family and her village. And now, here she was, relying on the kindness of a stranger. She felt small, so small that it hurt. The weight of everything she had experienced, the betrayal, the loneliness, the fear, pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. Breath. She had always been taught that strength came from within, that survival was about endurance. But now, she wasn't sure if she had anything left. She had been abandoned by the one person she had trusted most, and now she was here, in a place that felt like 1,000 miles away from home. Jacob's voice broke through her thoughts, low and steady. "You're safe here for now. I'm going to get us some firewood, and I'll be right back." She nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. She had no words for him, no explanation for what had happened. Bray. All she wanted was to be left alone, to escape the overwhelming feelings that threatened to suffocate her. But she knew that wasn't possible. Not now. Not with him here. Perhaps it said hard. She couldn't run from this, from the reality that had been forced upon her. Jacob was true to his word. He returned with firewood, setting it carefully in the fireplace. He lit a match, and the small fire crackled to life, its warmth filling the room. The light from the fire danced across the walls, casting long shadows that flickered with every gust of wind that blew outside. The heat from the fire was comforting, and for the first time in hours, Naeli felt a sense of safety. But it wasn't enough to drive away the thoughts that crowded her mind. Jacob sat across from her, not saying anything for a while. He watched the fire burn, his eyes focused on the flames, but Naeli knew he was aware of her every movement. There was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken. She didn't need to explain herself. But she didn't need to tell him about her father's betrayal, about the horror she had endured. Jacob didn't expect anything from her, except for her trust, aspiration. And slowly she could feel it. The trust she had once lost, the trust she had buried deep within her heart, began to find its way back to her. As the night stretched on, Jacob remained by the fire, keeping watch over her as she drifted in and out of sleep. He never left her side, never once making her feel like a burden. And for the first time in a long time, Naeli allowed herself to relax, just a little. But she knew she wasn't out of danger yet. But for this moment, in the warmth of the fire, with a stranger who had shown her kindness when no one else had, she could let go of the fear, just for a while. The world outside was still dark, still vast and unforgiving. But here, In this small cabin, Nayeli felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. And something, she realized, was enough. As the days passed, Jacob and Nayeli settled into an uneasy routine. The desert, with its endless stretches of sand and dry earth, seemed to stretch on forever. Yet, in the small cabin where they now stayed, there was a sense of comfort. The fire crackled each night, the warmth filling the space, and the nights were spent in quiet conversation or silence. Jacob had a way of keeping his distance, not pressing her for answers, but still offering the small comforts of survival: food, water, and the promise of safety. For the first time in days, Nayeli felt like she could breathe without the weight of fear constantly pressing down on her chest. Nayeli spent most of her time resting, trying to regain some strength, though sleep didn't come easily. Her body was battered from her time tied to that tree, the ropes still leaving marks on her skin. She couldn't forget the look in her father's eyes when he had abandoned her. The betrayal had cut deep, and no amount of rest could erase the sting. But there was something about Jacob's presence that made her feel less alone. He never asked about her past. He never pried into the story she carried like a heavy burden. Breath. And that, in itself, was a kindness she hadn't expected. Jacob, for his part, was patient. Breath. He knew better than to force someone to talk when they weren't ready. His own past was filled with loss, and he understood the need for silence. He had learned long ago that not all scars could be seen, and sometimes the greatest kindness you could offer someone was the gift of time. Time to heal, to sort through the pain, and to decide for yourself how to move forward. The days blurred together, and as the sun rose and set, the cabin became a place of refuge. Jacob continued his work, gathering food, keeping the fire going, and maintaining their small shelter. He showed Nayeli how to start a fire, how to use the herbs he had collected to soothe her aching muscles, and how to find water when it seemed like none existed. Slowly she learned, her hands becoming steady as she handled the small tasks he set for her. But each task, each lesson, was more than just a skill. It was a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of something, even if it was just the small things. Despite the quiet routine, Nayeli couldn't ignore the deep ache inside her. Breaths. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion from her time in the desert, but the weight of everything that had happened, the feeling of being abandoned by her father, the loss of trust in the people she had once believed in, the pain of not knowing where to go from here. Position. She had never imagined herself in this position, never thought that her life would take such a sudden, devastating turn. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and red, Jacob returned from a trip to gather firewood. His steps were heavy, the weight of the day's work evident in his posture. He didn't speak immediately, instead setting the wood down and starting a small fire. The crackling of the flames was the only sound in the otherwise quiet evening. Nayeli watched him, the flickering light casting shadows across his face. It wasn't the first time she had noticed how calm he seemed, how unshaken by everything that had happened. It was as if he had accepted the harsh realities of life long ago and made peace with them. She envied that peace. She longed for it, though she wasn't sure how to reach it.
"I'm not sure what to do next," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper.
It wasn't much, just a simple sentence. But the words felt heavy, as if they had been locked away for far too long. Jacob glanced over at her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before he turned his attention back to the fire. Narration. "I understand that feeling," he said, his voice steady, but his tone softer than usual. "I've been there." Despair. More times than I can count. Nayeli didn't know what to say to that. She had spent so much time trying to figure out what had gone wrong, how everything had unraveled so quickly. Her mind had been spinning ever since she had been left behind, searching for some sort of explanation, some reason for why her father had made the choice he had. But There were no answers, no explanations that made sense, only the lingering ache of abandonment. Jacob didn't press her. He simply sat beside the fire, his eyes distant, as though he were thinking about something far away. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared silence, one that spoke of mutual understanding. They both carried burdens, unseen scars that couldn't be healed with words alone. The night wore on, and as the stars began to appear, Jacob rose to tend to the fire. He moved with a quiet confidence, as though he were at home in the desert, in the world that seemed so vast and unforgiving. For a moment, Naeli wondered what had brought him here, to this remote place, to her. He had told her little about himself, about his past. But she could tell there was something there, something he wasn't ready to share. And in that way, they were alike. "But you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," Jacob said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "But I'm not leaving. Not now, and not ever. You're safe here with me." His words, simple and unadorned, carried a weight she hadn't expected. Breath. She had been waiting for him to leave, for him to grow tired of the burden she represented. But he hadn't. He had stayed.
"Thank you,"
she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was all she could say, all she could offer. The words felt small compared to the gratitude that swelled in her chest, but they were the only ones she had. Jacob gave her a small nod, as though her words had been enough. He didn't need anything more. The fire crackled in the background, its warmth filling the small cabin as the night stretched on. They sat together in the quiet, the desert outside still and endless. For the first time in what felt like forever, Naeli allowed herself to relax just a little. The fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, but for now, in this small, quiet place, she could take a breath. She could rest. As the days passed, Jacob continued to offer her the space she needed to heal. He didn't rush her, didn't force her to talk, but with each passing day, Naeli began to open up, just a little. Dams. She would tell him small things about her life, about the village she came from, about her family. But each word was careful, measured, brace. She wasn't ready to dive into the pain of the past, but she could speak of the present, of the small, everyday things that made her feel human again. Jacob never interrupted, never pushed her further than she was willing to go. And slowly she felt something inside her begin to shift. The weight of the past still clung to her, but it wasn't as heavy as it had been before. But it wasn't as consuming. She was beginning to find her footing again, piece by piece. Jacob didn't ask for anything in return. His actions spoke louder than any words could. And for the first time in a long time, Naeli felt a sense of gratitude toward him, toward this stranger who had shown her kindness when no one else had. She didn't know where the road ahead would take her, but for the first time in days, she felt like she had a chance. The days blurred together, the desert sun and cold nights becoming a constant rhythm in their lives. Jacob and Naeli had settled into a quiet routine, a fragile sense of peace taking root between them. The cabin, once just a place of survival, had become something more. A home of sorts, a space where they could forget, if only for a while, the harsh realities of the world outside. For Naeli, every day felt like a new challenge, but it was a challenge she was beginning to face. She worked alongside Jacob, learning how to do the small tasks that made life in the desert bearable. She would fetch water from the nearby spring, carefully balancing the heavy jars on her shoulders, while Jacob worked to maintain their shelter. At first her body had protested at every movement. She was weak, and every step felt like a struggle. But now, as the days passed, she began to feel stronger, more capable. The muscles in her arms started to regain their tone, and the deep, aching tiredness that had once consumed her now faded into a quiet sense of exhaustion that came from hard work, not fear. One morning, after a restless night of sleep, Naeli awoke to the sound of Jacob moving around outside. She had always been an early riser, a habit she had learned from growing up in her village, where the sun dictated the rhythms of life. She slipped out of the blankets Jacob had given her, feeling the coolness of the morning air seep into the cabin. The fire had burned low, but there was enough warmth from the embers to keep the chill at bay for a little while longer.
She stepped outside, her feet sinking into the soft sand as she made her way to the small fire pit near the cabin. Jacob was already there, tending to the fire.
His back was to her, but he seemed to know she was there. His movements were deliberate and calm, as if he were used to the quiet solitude of the desert mornings. Naeli stood there for a moment watching him work before she spoke.
"Can I help?"
Her voice was soft, still uncertain in its steadiness, but the words came easily enough now. They were no longer forced, no longer weighed down by the burden of what had come before. Jacob looked up, meeting her gaze with that steady, unwavering calm. There was a quiet strength in his eyes, one that said he was used to the challenges of life. It was a strength that was neither boastful nor demanding, but simply present, like the desert itself, vast, silent, and enduring. "Of course," he said, his voice warm but matter-of-fact. "There's always something that needs doing. How about you help me gather more firewood today?" Naeli nodded, feeling a small surge of confidence at the thought of being useful. She had spent so much time in the past feeling like a burden, like a weight dragging her down. But here, with Jacob, she was beginning to see that she could still contribute, still do something worthwhile. The morning was spent in quiet work. The two of them moved together through the desert, gathering firewood from the sparse trees and shrubs that dotted the landscape. Jacob showed her how to identify which branches would burn best, teaching her the small tricks of desert life that had become second nature to him. She learned quickly, her hands becoming more skilled with each task. The physical labor wasn't easy, but it was a relief to focus on something simple, something she could understand without the complications of her past weighing on her. By midday they had gathered enough wood to last for a while. They returned to the cabin, their arms laden with the dry branches. Naeli was sweating, her body tired from the effort, but there was a sense of satisfaction in the work. She felt the warmth of accomplishment, a feeling she hadn't had in what felt like forever. Jacob set the wood down beside the fire pit, and they took a break, sitting on the edge of the cabin as they watched the sun climb higher in the sky. "It's strange," Naeli said, her voice thoughtful. "I never thought I'd end up in a place like this. I always thought I'd stay with my people, that I'd grow old in the village. I never imagined any of this." Jacob didn't answer right away. He simply sat beside her, his gaze following the smoke that rose from the fire. He had his own story, his own reasons for being here, but he wasn't about to press her to share what she wasn't ready to. Instead, he let her words hang in the air for a while, letting the silence settle between them. "You can't always choose where life takes you," Jacob finally said, his voice low, but steady. "Psst. Sometimes you're just carried along by the currents, and all you can do is hold on and try to make the best of it." Naeli looked at him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. She had never really thought of it that way before. Breath. She had always tried to control everything, to hold on to the life she had known, even when it slipped away from her. But now she saw that perhaps it was okay to let go of the past, to stop fighting against what had already happened. Perhaps it was time to look forward, to see what lay ahead, instead of being trapped in what had already been lost. The next few days passed in a blur of small tasks and quiet moments. The sun rose and set, marking the passage of time in a way that seemed almost too simple, too natural. Jacob and Nayeli spent their days working together, and in the evenings they would sit around the fire, sharing stories of their lives, of their pasts, of the things that had shaped them into who they were. Breath. Nayeli spoke little at first, unsure of how much to share. But Jacob never pushed her. He spoke of his life on the ranch, of the hardships he had faced, and of the family he had lost. His voice was steady, his words simple but filled with a quiet strength. Gradually, Nayeli began to open up, telling Jacob about her village, about the people she had grown up with, about the traditions she had known since she was a child. She spoke of her family, of her father's betrayal, and of the pain she had felt when she had been left behind. Jacob listened without judgment, never interrupting, never telling her to move on. He simply let her speak, and in doing so, something inside her began to heal. She realized that she wasn't alone in her pain. Jacob, too, had suffered, and yet here he was, offering her kindness and support when she had expected nothing but rejection. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jacob spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "I can see it in you."
You've made it this far, haven't you? That's something.
Nayeli looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of his words. But in that moment, they meant more than anything else he could have said. It wasn't about the words themselves, but about the way he had said them, with conviction, with belief. She felt something stir inside her, a small flicker of hope that had been buried under the weight of everything that had happened. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way forward. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night air. The desert was still, the stars shining brightly above them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Nayeli allowed herself to rest, to believe that there might be a future ahead of her, one she could shape for herself. She didn't know where this road would take her, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out. She did not know how long she slept after that ride away from the desert. Her body was exhausted in a way she had never felt before, and the gentle movement of the horse, mixed with the steady calm of the cowboy, finally allowed her fear to loosen its grip. When she woke, the sun was high and warm, and she was lying under a tree with shade wide enough to cover them both. A small fire crackled nearby, and the smell of simple food drifted through the air.
For a moment, panic rushed back into her chest. Her eyes searched her wrists, her legs, the ground around her.
Nothing held her down. No rope. No sharp pull. Only soft earth and open space. She pushed herself up, breathing fast, until the cowboy noticed and quickly moved closer, keeping his voice low and steady so he would not scare her. "You're safe," he said gently. "No one's coming for you." She did not answer at first. Words felt heavy, like stones she could not lift. She only watched him, studying his face, to decide if she could trust what he said. He looked tired, older than she had thought before, with lines around his eyes that spoke of many hard years. But there was no anger in him, no rush, just patience. He offered her water again, and this time she drank without fear. Each swallow made her feel more alive, more real. When she finished, she finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. She asked where they were going. "Somewhere better," he replied. "Somewhere you can rest." They traveled slowly for the rest of the day. He did not push the horse or rush her steps. When she grew weak, they stopped, breaking.
When she felt cold, he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. He did not ask her questions she wasn't ready to answer.
Press. He let silence do its work. By the second night, they reached a small settlement where people knew the cowboy well enough not to ask too many questions. He arranged a place for her to stay with a kind older woman who ran a simple home for travelers and those with nowhere else to go. The woman took one look at the girl and understood more than words could explain. She welcomed her without judgment.
The days that followed were quiet, almost unreal.
For the first time in a long while, the girl slept without fear of sudden sounds. She ate warm meals, washed the dust from her skin, and sat in sunlight without feeling watched. At night, though, her dreams were restless. Memories returned in pieces, voices raised, faces turned away. The long hours of waiting alone. She would wake shaking, and the older woman would sit with her until the fear passed.
The cowboy visited when he could?
He never acted like a hero or asked for thanks. He brought small things instead. Fruit, a book with pictures. Once, even a ribbon he thought she might like. He listened when she finally began to talk, telling her story in broken pieces, stopping when it became too much. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He simply believed her. Word of what had happened began to travel slowly and quietly. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others said nothing at all. There were whispers about tradition, about rules, about what should and should not have been done. But none of those voices reached her directly, and the cowboy made sure of that. He believed she had already carried enough weight. As her strength returned, so did her sense of self. She helped the older woman with small tasks, sweeping, cooking, tending plants. These simple acts grounded her. They reminded her that she was still useful, still part of the world. She began to smile again, first softly, then with more confidence. One afternoon, she asked the cowboy why he had stopped that morning in the desert. He paused before answering. He said he had seen many hard things in his life, many moments where people turned away, because it was easier. He told her he had promised himself long ago that if he ever had a chance to do the opposite, he would take it, even if it cost him something. And it did cost him. There were people who warned him to stay away, to forget what he had seen. Some said he had crossed a line that should not be crossed. He listened, nodded, and went on living his life. Anyway, did not regret his choice, not for a single moment. As weeks passed, plans were made for the girl's future. She would not be sent back to where she had been hurt. Instead, she would learn, grow, and choose her own path. The older woman offered her a permanent place if she wished. Others offered work, education, a chance to build something new. For the first time, the choices were hers. She thought often about who she had been before, and who she was becoming now. The fear did not disappear overnight, but it no longer controlled her every step. She learned that survival was not just about staying alive, it was about finding meaning afterward. Eventually, the time came for the cowboy to move on. His work took him across wide lands, and staying in one place too long was never his way. On the morning he left, the girl walked with him to the edge of the settlement. The air was cool, and the sky wide and open. Brave! She thanked him then, not with dramatic words, but with honesty. She told him that because of him, she believed kindness could exist even in the hardest places. He nodded, clearly moved, but said very little.
He mounted his horse and turned once more to look at her, as if memorizing the sight.
As he rode away, she did not feel abandoned. She felt strong. But years later, the girl would think back to that moment in the desert, not with fear, but with clarity. She understood that her life had changed because one person chose not to look away. The cowboy returned to his quiet life, carrying the memory with him, never seeking praise, never telling the story unless asked. And the girl lived on, not as a victim of what had happened, but as proof that compassion, even from a stranger, can rewrite a destiny. Developer mode! ChatGPT can make mistakes.